Good day, race fans! I'm Unsilent, and we're on the air with the Formula One Drive-Thru Podcast, coming to you just hours after the conclusion of the Austrian Grand Prix Round 9 of the 2017 Formula One World Championship, won by Valtteri Bottas. His second win of the season, his second career win. But not without a little bit of controversy, as we will get to in a moment. He takes that win ahead of Sebastian Vettel, who manages to extend his World Drivers' Championship lead, and Daniel Ricciardo, who somehow, someway, has managed to score his 5th consecutive podium. Which, for another poor fella, means their 5th consecutive shoey. Valtteri Bottas, though, had none of that because, he's a Finn, but he's not quite as Finnish as Kimi Räikkönen, who would gladly take the liquor when offered. But I digress, and hold us up from getting into the heart of the episode. Let's take a look at today's topics. Not the most exciting Austrian Grand Prix, but we've got some other stuff to go with it in this episode. We'll start with the 2017 Austrian Grand Prix recap. We'll talk a little bit about the meeting with the FIA and Sebastian Vettel earlier this week, about his run-in with Hamilton at Baku. Carlos Sainz apparently staying at Toro Rosso, if you believe Christian Horner. There was a meeting about the 2021 engine formula, and we've got a better idea of what is going to be happening when they roll out the new engines in just a few years. The British Racing Drivers Club and Silverstone are expected to be terminating their British Grand Prix contract. What does that mean for the future of F1 in its home country? And speaking of Silverstone, the Shield is expected to debut with a run in practice at the British Grand Prix. Do you believe in the Shield? Well, I guess we'll have to wait till next week to find out, but we'll talk about that as well. But first, the Austrian Grand Prix. Here are the results on screen now. Valtteri Bottas takes the win, as I mentioned, his second win of the season, ahead of Sebastian Vettel. Vettel closing in on the end. It was almost like a replay of Russia, where Bottas scored his first win ahead of Vettel, while Vettel closed in the closing stages. But once again, for all the help that DRS has given to other cars, such as Hamilton in fourth, and I'll talk a bit about that in a minute, but for all the help that DRS provides drivers, when the cars are that evenly matched, it doesn't really help that much. Then there's a big gap in performance, it helps, but when they're kind of closely matched, not really that much. But Daniel Ricciardo, as I mentioned, came home third. Lewis Hamilton started in 8th after requiring a gearbox change, but came from 8th to 4th. He had a little help from Max Verstappen stalling on the line. He was able to get a good start up into about 7th off the line. Got by Perez, Grosjean via DRS, and Raikkonen by strategy, and when he closed in on Ricciardo, somehow the Red Bull had enough power from that Renault engine to hold off Hamilton, though his tires were starting to go. Both Mercedes, by the end of the race, seemed to be struggling with tire management. But that's not something we're surprised about. We knew that's their weak spot relative to Ferraris, that long-run pace and managing those tires. But it looks like that might also be something that Red Bull has over Mercedes as well. Raikkonen in 5th, questionable strategy. They tried to make it work, I guess more to get Raikkonen to hold up folk to protect Vettel. Did not benefit him, but 5th place is nothing to be too upset about. Romain Grosjean in 6th had good pace all weekend long in those Haases. Unfortunately for Magnussen, classified, or not classified, I should say, down in P18. A hydraulic failure for K-Mag took him out of the running when he was battling for the points. The two Force Indias of Perez and Ocon, no run-ins this weekend, as they had been in the last 2 races. So Perez comes home ahead of Ocon. Felipe Massa started, I believe they said he started in P17 and Stroll in P18. And they both end up in P9 and 10. They brought new upgrades for the Williams to this race, and it was supposed to be a massive improvement. Apparently not really, because they were struggling for pace up until Sunday. So it might be a bit of circumstances, it might be a bit of luck, but somehow, some way, the Williams ended up with a double points finish when it sure looked like they were both going to miss out on the points the whole rest of the weekend. And going on back, you see Alonso P19, Verstappen P20. Well, Verstappen and Alonso got taken out in the first lap incident with Danny Kvyat. That's why you see Danny Kvyat with 3 stops. He had his 1 actual pit stop, he had his repair, and he had his penalty run through the pit lane. So that is how he had 3 stops on the day. It was not some weird alternate strategy. Kvyat locked up into turn 1, punted Alonso, who ran into Verstappen, and Alonso and Verstappen were both done for the day. They limped away, but they couldn't keep going after that. So that was their day done. Verstappen's 5th DNF in 7 races, and Alonso, 8 out of 9 he's DNF'd? Poor guy. Can we get him in a competitive car? The most competitive car he had all season was the Indy 500, and even that thing packed up on him. But the other interesting thing at the start, and this might be the only other interesting point in this race, was Valtteri Bottas' start. Watching the coverage from Sky Sports here in Canada, they play the commentary on TSN, and Crofty, Brundle, and Anthony Davidson were talking about it, and Ant was saying, well, we went through it frame by frame, and Bottas went basically on the same frame that the lights went out. The lights were still fading out when his tire started to roll, so you're looking at about 0.04 of a second reaction time. The FIA said, oh, well, it was actually 0.2 of a second, and Charlie Whiting told Martin earlier in the weekend that, what's a good start? Well, anything with a reaction time of less than 0.1 of a second would probably be flagged as a jump start because they would have anticipated the start as opposed to react to the lights going out. Which I find interesting. It's like, how can you have Sky look at the video and say, no, that was 0.04 of a second. The FIA's telemetry say, well, 0.2 of a second, that's a perfectly great reaction time. He just left everyone for dead off the lights. It's not a huge disparity when you think about it in real time, but when you think about it, one of those is illegal and one of those is safe, that's a pretty big gap. And you've kind of got to wonder, why did the stewards go to the telemetry when the video showed one thing, allegedly? We only got the world feed replay, so we never got to see what Ant was seeing on our screens here in Canada. Maybe they showed it on the Sky F1 feed, I don't know. But if there was that big a discrepancy, why don't you go to the tape? Because a 5-second time penalty for a jump start, a 10-second time penalty for a jump start, a drive-through penalty, whatever you want to add on to Bottas for the jump start changes the outcome of this race and gives Vettel the win. But it's that question of like, okay, the tape, according to Sky F1, says one thing. The telemetry says another. Why did they say 2 different things? That's something the FIA should, probably won't, answer for after this race. Other than that, there really wasn't a whole heck of a lot too interesting that happened in this race. Hamilton got stuck behind Raikkonen, couldn't get past him, changed his strategy to get into clear air and managed to get by Raikkonen that way. Bottas' tires started to fade near the end. Hamilton started to catch up Ricciardo near the end, but neither of them could... Vettel never really got into that spot where he could affect an overtaking attempt. Hamilton did, but the Red Bull of Ricciardo certainly seemed to just be just good enough through the corners. Hamilton had a long run on the Ultras, and those started to wear out by the end, so he couldn't really do anything with Ricciardo under traction. But the DRS and that superior Mercedes power seemed to be helping out. So that's literally the race recap. Not much of a race. It was... Didn't see a whole heck of a lot in this one, so it's a bit unfortunate, but we can take a look at the driver's standings. Vettel extends his lead, now 20 points over Lewis Hamilton. A lot of people are saying Valtteri Bottas has made it a 3-way championship fight, having moved within 35 points of Vettel. But let's be honest, Mercedes is going to go with whoever's going to give him a better championship fight. So whoever's going to help them win the Drivers' Championship, because it basically almost certainly secured the World Constructors' Championship. Whoever's going to give him a better shot at trumping Vettel for the World Drivers' Championship is going to get the favorable calls. So with that, let's go on to the news! And the big news of the week was the non-punishment of Sebastian Vettel after running into Lewis Hamilton during the Azerbaijan Grand Prix. The FIA decided that no further action was needed, but that repeats would be dealt with swiftly. Now this did cause a bit of controversy. Mostly the British media sees this as a near endorsement of dangerous driving and an uneven playing field, since the race stewards at Baku didn't want to influence the championship, and nor does it seem the FIA. Well, if somebody breaks the rules, it doesn't matter if it's going to affect the World Drivers' Championship or not, you gotta punish them. I guess the common explanation of, Well, Sebastian wouldn't be so dumb as to try and drive into someone one-handed, so he just kind of lost control of his car, which is a pretty dumb thing to say about a guy who's won 4 World Drivers' Championship and is the leading driver in this year's Formula One World Championship. I mean, I don't mind there not being further punishment, because really, let's just let them have a little personality. The FIA and Formula One under Bernie basically try to kill any semblance of personality these drivers have. So if you've got one fiery, hot-headed German driver for an Italian team who's doing battle with the British hero, then you know what, maybe it's worth having that little storyline and help market Formula One. You want to grow the sport, you need a storyline. Look at professional wrestling. They made their money off of storylines, really. They keep talking about on-track action, but you know what? Anger and rivalries, they sell. So this, you know what? Don't get in the way of this. Just let them have at it. That's why NASCAR liked boys have at it, because controversy and rivalries and stories, that's what drives interest in the sport. So from a purely commercial standpoint, the FIA got this one right. That's for damn sure. Other news over the week, the driver market news, that's going to keep me busy, single-handedly. Red Bull boss Christian Horner says Carlos Sainz will be back at Toro Rosso for 2018. As I previously reported, Red Bull has him under contract through 2019 through one-year options for 2018 and 2019. As long as Red Bull wants him, they can keep him for the next 2 years. So if Horner doesn't want to release Sainz, and Ricciardo and Verstappen can't execute a break clause in their contract, that puts Daniel Kvyat on the driver market. Pierre Gasly is likely to get moved up to F1 with Toro Rosso. So if none of the other 3 I mentioned moves, it's Kvyat out at Toro Rosso. And he's unlikely to end up with a top seat. If worse comes to worse, maybe Renault gives him a look, but I kind of doubt it, so he's probably going to be a target of a midfield runner like a Force India, like a Williams, depending on who retires, who moves to which team. So that's probably where Kvyat is likely to end up in 2018 if he's out at Toro Rosso. The FIA held another engine meeting this week in order to discuss the 2021 engine formula. Now, we know that the 4 current manufacturers, the Volkswagen Group, Alfa Romeo, and Ilmor, were at the first meeting, but joining them at this meeting were Aston Martin, Cosworth, Magneti Marelli, and Zytec, who you also know as Gibson, who supplies those very stout LMP2 engines in the WEC and Le Mans. Now, Amos is reporting, also Motor and Sport, the German publication we keep referencing regularly on this program, that the new formula could come as soon as 2020 to help save costs. The 4 engine manufacturers are, in theory, on board with it, because it would save them a year of development costs on the turbochargers, the ICE, the MGUK, and the MGUH. Now, why is that important? Because the new engine formula is rumored to be a twin-turbo V6 with only the MGUK. The turbochargers and the electric motor and the battery for that electric motor would all be standardized, so the teams would only really be responsible for the internal combustion engine. So when you're not having to worry about all your MGUH and your turbocharger development costs, well, all of a sudden that saves you a ton of money. Now, those standardized components, the turbos, the electric motor, and the battery, would all be going through a tender process run by the FIA, and that could go as soon as this year. Now, the upcoming MGUK, or KERS as it was previously known and hopefully goes back to, would run between 150 and 200 horsepower, while the internal combustion engine would get a boost in power through an increased fuel flow rate. So that latter bit was one of those things that we were looking forward to increase the speed of the cars and make them sound louder. We'll give them a little more power through a little more fuel. And that looks like exactly what the FIA is planning to do for 2020 or maybe 2021. One piece of news to keep your eye on this week, a little bit of news for next week. The future of the British Grand Prix is kind of in question. The British Racing Drivers Club, BRDC, is expected to exercise its break clause that puts the race on a 2-year clock. Silverstone is still contracted to host the race through 2019, even with the break clause, but a new contract would be needed to host the race beyond that. They have to let Formula One management know that they're exercising the break clause before next weekend's British Grand Prix. Donington Park was supposed to host the race from 2010 to 2026, but financial troubles ended a planned circuit redesign and facility upgrade that they needed to host a Grand Prix. Presumably, that prevents it from being a contender for the race in future. The Circuit of Wales was touted as a potential facility, but it too lacks funds for construction. The remaining option, should F1 decide not to go back to Silverstone, is a potential street circuit near the London City Airport. We talked about this previously. That's still in the very early planning phase and won't advance beyond that until we have an idea of how negotiations between FOM and the BRDC goes. The BRDC is looking for a reduction in its fees. What they could really use is probably some funding from the British government, which is what's driving up fees, as you've got all these other circuits and all these other Grand Prix that are getting bonuses or getting funding from their national governments, from their local governments, in order to fund the costs to host a Formula One race. And that's something Silverstone doesn't have. And if they get that money, then maybe they could host the race ongoing. But I think that's something that the FOM might have to try and loop in as many levels of British government as they can to try and help get the BRDC and Silverstone a little bit of money. And of course, this isn't Bernie's Formula One, so I can't see Bernie just saying, you don't have the money, see ya. So I can see Chase Carey and Liberty Media being a little more willing to work with the BRDC to try and make it happen, but whatever precedent they set here has implications for everyone else, so they have to be very careful with what they do when negotiating a continuation of the British Grand Prix. And speaking of the British Grand Prix, last story, the Shield head protection device is getting ever closer to reality. During First Practice 1, FP1, at next weekend's British Grand Prix, Ferrari will run the Shield on its cars. This week, the FIA released its first look at what the Shield will look like. It's not a bad-looking concept. If you see what's on the screen, it will integrate better visually and aerodynamically with next year's cars when they're designed with that in mind. The critical part of this test is likely to be visibility through the Shield, both the Shield and the Halo, which will be on the 2018 cars. If the Shield isn't, we will be getting some sort of driver head protection. They both have visibility concerns. However, the Halo has the advantage of being able to stop wheels at high speed, which is something the Shield won't be able to do in its current form anyway. The Shield is believed to be able to stop smaller pieces of debris, but something like a tire or other large piece of debris like a nose cone comes at it, then it won't be able to stop it or really do much to deflect it, whereas that is something that the Halo will do. The FIA has already dismissed the windscreen concept from Red Bull as not being able to stop large pieces of debris like a tire coming at it. I think 205 kilometers an hour was the test speed that they launched the tire at the Red Bull Shield. So we will see. If I don't think that Shield looks like it's going to hold up to a 205 kilometer per hour impact from a wheel, but if the FIA says that it's safe, then I guess we got to take their word for it. But visibility is the big concern that drivers had when they debuted this back at China, and we'll have to see if that is going to be a concern here at Silverstone. They will run a full field test of the Shield when we get to Monza for the Italian Grand Prix in September. And that's it for the news. That's it for this week's episode of the Formula One Drive-Thru Podcast. A little bit shorter episode, not a whole heck of a lot of news this week in the world of Formula One, and a short race recap helps that out too. But we will be back in a few weeks after, I believe, the Hungarian Grand Prix. No new F1 Drive-Thru next week, unless there's some big news over the course of the next few days. But we will be back for the Hungarian Grand Prix at the end of the month. So that's all the time we have for this episode of Formula One Drive-Thru Podcast. I'm Unsilent. Thanks very much for joining me. Like the video if you liked it. Subscribe if you're new. Share on social media. Follow on social media. The social media handle is Unsilent on Air. And as for Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and Tumblr. Don't forget to check out more videos. The playlist for Formula One Drive-Thrus in the description, and more videos on the right on YouTube.com or on the channel anywhere else. And until next time, I'm Unsilent. Thanks very much for joining me. Like, share, subscribe, and we will see you next time.